always been captivated by the involvement of characters when it comes to storytelling. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, his main characters, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, are essential factors in developing the plot and the theme of the play, which is that certain bad actions and decisions can affect an individual negatively in many aspects, including mentally, physically, and emotionally. Both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth go through dramatic changes throughout the play because of the decisions they made and the consequences of those actions. And while Macbeth is a title character, I've been pulled towards his wife, Lady Macbeth, while studying the play. Many argue that Lady Macbeth is a static character, which I disagree. After days of designing the character's appearance, everything from hair color to clothing, I've created the concept art of Lady Macbeth throughout the acts, focusing on the changes of her appearance, her implied mental health, and her position as a character when she's put next to her husband. Now, without further ado, the character concept art of Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth. We get introduced to Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5. Lady Macbeth's soliloquy from the very beginning immediately lets the audience interpret Lady Macbeth as ambitious, dangerous, aggressive, confident, and in control. Her tone and diction throughout the lines 10 to 29 indicates force, control, and confidence within her. By successfully writing in an apostrophe for Lady Macbeth in lines 38 to 53, Shakespeare really lets the audience know how dangerous the woman can be. Her dictions during the infamous "unsex me here" lines is venomous, aggressive, and very violent, also extremely unfeminine. Later in the act, Lady Macbeth clearly shows superiority over her husband by being passive-aggressive and threatening towards him. With all this said, I also think it's very important to note her words in line 64. Look the innocent flower, but be the serpent underneath. The witch seems to have two personalities, a kind hostess towards King Duncan and a violent woman with dangerous thoughts is very interesting to me. I wanted to portray all of that in her illustration here. The tilt of her chin upwards indicates her superiority as well as confidence in her greatness. The way she puts her hands on her hips also indicates the power that she has. Here she is wearing red, a color of power as well as blood, symbolizing the crimes that she is determined to commit. I wanted to portray her as a beautiful woman on the outside as well. Her fair skin, bright hair, slim physique, and other physical factors will hopefully indicate that. However, I also want to portray her as a serpent underneath. I did this by illustrating her with shadowed eyes, a villainous trait to show malice in animated or illustrated characters. I also designed her with green eyes, a color of greed and envy. I paid extra attention to her facial features, making sure that they were sharp at all angles, which is a masculine trait when designing a character. In a way, Lady Macbeth in Act 2 is just like Lady Macbeth in Act 1, except much more extreme. She continues to be in control, aggressive, violent, and very dangerous, and she still considers herself superior, showing this by taking the daggers in her own hands when she declares Macbeth as being infirm of purpose in line 53. Because Lady Macbeth's character is as consistent in Act 2 just as she was in Act 1, not a lot of her physical appearance and posture has changed. She still carries herself with a tilted chin and upright posture. Her expression, however, in Act 2 changes slightly. The audience only sees her in Act 2, Scene 2, where she is obviously frustrated and angry with her husband's paranoia. Therefore, I illustrated her as an angry and more threatening person, as her diction during the scene suggests. Since there wasn't a lot of change in her character, I turned towards her clothing. I illustrated her in a white nightgown, smeared and splattered with blood. The color white, as suggested multiple times in the scene, is associated with cowardice. She says that she shames to wear a heart so white in line 65, suggesting that she thinks she's much braver than her husband will ever be and that the act does not affect her in any way. However, it is her later on in the play that commits suicide out of guilt. I also associate the color with vulnerability, and to me, this is the scene where Lady Macbeth allows herself to be vulnerable to guilt and by going through with the murder. The blood smeared over her is a symbol of violence and guilt that will be a burden for her forever, soon becoming the vulnerability that leads her to her own death. Act 3 is where Shakespeare really emphasizes on the relationship shift between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and how that influences them as individual characters. While Lady Macbeth is still confident, aggressive, and strong, the audience gets a sense that she's no longer in charge or in control of Macbeth. In the interactions between the two of them in scenes 2 and 4, Lady Macbeth has significantly less lines than her husband. Macbeth begins to shut her out of plans, calling her feminine names like love and dear, and she begins acting less like a partner in greatness and more like Macbeth's anchor, holding him down whenever he begins to hallucinate. My illustration of her here is quite similar to how I illustrated her in Act 1, yet very different. Her dress is now grander now that she is queen, and the elaborate and gold details indicate that her position is powerful. However, her posture says otherwise. Her chin is now tilted down, indicating that she no longer is superior to her husband. Based on her diction in scene 4 and how she's constantly threatening and shaming her husband, Shakespeare says that she is still trying to hold on to that power, so I use this information to illustrate her with only one hand on her hip, partial power. Her facial expression here almost resembles her in Act 1, which is contained in malice and venom, as she now needs to remain composed as a queen and as Macbeth's anchor. Lady Macbeth does not make an appearance in Act 4. However, based on her dramatic change between Act 3 and Act 5, the audience can conclude that this is where she begins to fall apart. Here, she is illustrated in a gray dress, not quite broken or completely consumed by guilt yet, but on the surface of cracking and losing it. Her hair is still in a regal style, but it's untamed and unruly. Her posture becomes rigid and stiff and no longer confident. She becomes paler and more alert with wild, scared eyes. Her eyes were also showing signs of lack of sleep, which is one of the many consequences mentioned by Shakespeare when one is overcome by guilt and paranoia. This is the start of Lady Macbeth's downfall. One of the very successful things Shakespeare did in this particular act to show how serious Lady Macbeth's situation is to have onlookers in the scene evaluating her, in addition to having her unravel her thoughts during a sleepwalk, which touches yet again on the motive of sleep. In scene 5, where the sleepwalk took place, the doctor notes that what was happening to Lady Macbeth is something to do with her mental health, and that she has obviously done something terrible. She is beyond his practice, as he says in line 53. As the audience, we know that Lady Macbeth has indeed committed a crime, and it was that guilt consuming her mind. We also know now, thanks to the doctor, that she is beyond repair. The idea that she is breaking apart because of guilt is confirmed through her lines, where Lady Macbeth is constantly referring back to blood, a symbol of violence and guilt. She also repeats a lot of her words like "what's done cannot be undone" in line 61, as if she's trying to assure herself. Judging from her diction, she is afraid, guilty, vulnerable, and paranoid, almost mirroring her husband when he first murders Duncan in Act 2. This is Lady Macbeth's downfall, where she is at her worst. I tried to illustrate her as weak and fragile, representing her vulnerability. Her nightgown is completely black, indicating that the guilt and the terrible actions has now consumed her. She remains pale, frigid, and stiff, and her hair remains unruly. I tried to make her expression something that depicts anxiousness and panic. The eyes in particular I wanted to be alert and terror-stricken. It is also obvious in this illustration that she has been losing some sleep, as her eyes are now lined with red and her under eyes significantly darker than they ever were. The dramatic change in Lady Macbeth's character, how she changes from a fearless, strong woman to an afraid, terror-stricken sufferer, helps build and develop Shakespeare's extremely strong theme of how certain bad actions and decisions can negatively impact an individual and change them forever. Shakespeare has not only one but two strong characters, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, be affected by the decision to murder King Duncan. Because of this strong theme, Macbeth, after hundreds and hundreds of years, still remains an infamous tragedy, respected, studied, and interpreted in countless different ways all over the globe.